Picture this. It's the sweltering heat of August 1914. You're stepping directly onto the Grand Boulevard of Unter den Linden in Berlin. You can literally hear it before you even see it, this sharp, rhythmic striking of drums echoing off the stone facades. It's the signal, the actual heartbeat of a global slaughter about to begin. We aren't just going to look at dry dates on the timeline today, okay? We're stepping right into a living, breathing moment where the outcomes were entirely unknown, the risks were absolutely existential, and a handful of human decisions were about to alter the course of civilization forever. Let's dive in. Right in the middle of this electric atmosphere, on August 4th, 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II delivered these incredibly famous words. He said, "I no longer see different parties. All I see is Germans." Now, on the surface, that sounds like an absolute miracle of patriotism, doesn't it? A fractured, divided nation suddenly coming together as one. But the truth is, this was a masterful, highly calculated piece of political theater. He weaponized this grand illusion of national unity to justify plunging all of Europe into darkness. Because underneath all that majestic rhetoric lies a genuinely terrifying question. Think about it. How exactly does a state convince millions of violently anti-militarist working-class citizens to willingly, enthusiastically march straight into a meat grinder? Over the next few minutes, we're going to peel back the layers of this history. We'll see exactly how complex web of constitutional loopholes, rigid military timetables, and some truly brilliant political manipulation dragged an entire empire into an inescapable nightmare. Section 1. The Illusion of Defense. To really grasp the visceral reality of this moment, you have to put yourself in the streets of Berlin and feel the sheer panic in the air. Soldiers are marching from the palace to publicly proclaim that the nation is under attack. You see, this wasn't framed to the public as some grand war of imperial conquest. No, it was framed purely as survival. On July 31st, right after reading a telegram about Russian mobilization, the Kaiser declared a state of imminent threat of war. The German people genuinely believed they were cornered. And this right here was Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg's most desperate, high-stakes gamble. Look, the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD, was the biggest party in the Reichstag, and they were vehemently anti-war. The Chancellor knew, for a fact, that the only way to neutralize them and prevent a massive, paralyzing general strike was to convince them they were the victims here. By waiting for Russia to mobilize first, he could point the finger directly at the despotic blood czar of Russia. Overnight, he transformed what was basically an imperial power grab into a supposed fight for national survival. Section 2. The Constitutional Trap. Now, you might be wondering, wait a minute, didn't Germany have laws in place to prevent one single man from starting a world war? Well, yes, technically they did. But how the Kaiser bypassed them is a fascinating story. It's hidden in the fatal flaws of their 1871 Constitution, a document that, entirely by accident, created a military dictatorship wrapped in the polite, acceptable guise of a constitutional monarchy. The contradiction was baked right into the law itself. Article 11 said the Kaiser needed the federal state's permission to declare an offensive war. Sounds reasonable, right? But then you look at Article 63, which made the Kaiser the supreme warlord, giving him absolute unchecked command of the unified army and navy. Meaning he didn't actually need Parliament to deploy his troops. He could just create facts on the ground, mobilizing armies, sending them to the borders, and effectively make war totally inevitable before the politicians even had a chance to cast a vote. Because the elected Reichstag could only vote on the budget, and the Prussian law of siege handed total executive power directly to regional military commanders the second war was declared, the civilian government was effectively paralyzed. Boom. Just like that. The moment the Kaiser cried wolf, civil liberties vanished into thin air, and the military entirely absorbed the state. Section 3. The Military Straitjacketed. Enter the infamous Schlieffen Plan. Dreamed up in 1905, this was Germany's incredibly desperate, mathematical blueprint for surviving a two-front war against both France and Russia. It was actually inspired by Hannibal's ancient encirclement tactics at the Battle of Cannae. The plan absolutely demanded that Germany strike first, and strike incredibly fast. They gave themselves exactly 45 days to march through neutral Belgium, crush Paris, and then literally load their millions of soldiers onto trains to go fight the Russians in the east. It was rigid. It was a mathematical straitjacket that left absolutely zero room for diplomatic de-escalation. Looking at this timeline, you can literally feel the claustrophobic panic of the July crisis setting in. Because of this lockstep mobilization system, the exact moment Russia mobilized on July 30th, Germany's strategic clock started ticking. They couldn't just sit back, wait, and negotiate. To survive a two-front war, they had to immediately launch a preemptive strike against France. The military plan had entirely 100% hijacked state policy. Section 4. The Castle Peace. They called this moment the Bergfrieden, or the Castle Peace. It's actually a fascinating medieval concept. If you are trapped inside a besieged fortress, quarreling with your neighbor is strictly forbidden because division means certain death. In 1914, this was hailed as a miraculous moment of national unity. But in reality, it was the sudden death of democratic freedom. It effectively silenced all domestic political competition, halted democratic elections entirely, and mandated that labor unions promise not to strike for the entire duration of the conflict. And here is where the chancellor's manipulation becomes just tragically genius. Just days prior, in late July, the socialist SPD was out in the streets organizing massive protests, screaming down with war. But by framing this conflict as a desperate, do-or-die defense against Tsarist Russian oppression, the chancellor tricked this internationalist, anti-militarist party into unanimously voting to fund the very war they absolutely despised. Caught up in this weird, intoxicating spell of the Bergfrieden, the parliament just willingly surrendered its own power. They passed the War Enabling Act, transferring legislative authority from the elected Reichstag straight to the unelected Bundesrat. This allowed the state to aggressively centralize the economy, suspend basic civic rights, and run the country purely by decree. The people had essentially locked themselves inside their own cage. Section 5. The Annexationist Frenzy. But as the bloody, horrific reality of the trenches set in by September 1914, that whole noble facade of a defensive war rapidly slipped away. Driven by the pan-German League and industrial elites, it mutated into an unquenchable thirst for global dominance. I mean, look at these demands. They wanted to reduce Belgium to a vassal state, strip France of its industrial wealth, and initiate these horrifying ethnic land consolidations in Eastern Europe just to make room for German settlers. This aggressive push became known as the War Aims movement. They were demanding a Siegfrieden, a totally, completely victorious peace. And here is the profound, tragic irony of it all. Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, he secretly doubted a total victory was even possible after their grand plan failed at the Battle of the Marne. But he couldn't publicly walk back these extreme, radical goals without fracturing that fragile political castle peace back home. He had become a prisoner of the very nationalism he had stoked. So, what happens when your strategy is failing? You double down. As the situation deteriorated, the German military embarked on the totalization of the war. In late 1916, they actually lifted press censorship, not because they cared about freedom of speech, but to let radical annexationists dominate public discourse and artificially whip up morale. This escalation spiraled all the way to their fateful, desperate decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, a move that virtually guaranteed the entry of the United States, sealing the ultimate doom of the entire German Empire. Section 6. The Shattered Truce. Eventually, the illusion just completely shatters. The working class, who are starving and dying in the millions at this point, finally realize their monumental sacrifices are just being exploited for imperialist greed. The SPD, the exact same party that had enabled the war in 1914, fractured right down the middle in 1917. The newly formed Independent Social Democrats broke away, demanding an immediate end to what they called the human slaughter, completely destroying any remaining myth of an unbreakable national unity. And the civilian government? Completely sidelined, trapped by its own constitutional flaws, its intense fear of the public, and the massive foundational lies it told to start the war, they were entirely eclipsed. By late 1916, Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff assumed total control. They established a de facto military dictatorship, systematically bleeding the nation dry until it entirely collapsed from the inside out. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a profound, lingering question about human nature and the mechanics of state power. Was that Bergfrieden a tragic but genuine miracle of national unity in a time of crisis? Or was it the calculated, totalitarian precursor to the suffocating Volksgemeinschaft that would completely consume Germany just 2 decades later? What lessons actually matter today when a state willingly trades its democratic soul for the grand illusion of a unified, victorious empire? Think about that as you reflect on the history we've reconstructed today.